We believe the Buckeyes will be back on the field in East Lansing to take on a Michigan State. There are all sorts of scenarios and qualifiers, as there always are, but of course it's 2020. We got Pat Murphy on the line from Bucknuts 247 Sports to help us break down the Buckeyes. Pat, how you doing today?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Doing just fine. So, of course, the Big Ten had allowed Illinois and Ohio State to hit the field last week. The Buckeyes and Gene Smith opted out of the game. But as we sit here on a Tuesday evening, it appears as though things, at least right now, are a full go with no additional positive tests.
Yes, we got word today that Ohio State was going to practice. Now, that is anyone who didn't test positive or wasn't considered a close contact. So the numbers are obviously less than they would be at full strength, and that includes head coach Ryan Day, who is only taking part in the virtual side of things, the meetings and whatnot. But not only is not at practice this week, but won't coach if there is a game on Saturday against Michigan State. So the Buckeyes numbers are certainly down. We don't know specifically what that looks like or what it could mean for Saturday in terms of who plays, who doesn't. But they are taking steps towards playing. They shut down the facility last week, starting on Friday, went through a deep cleaning and kind of all that process. And then actually on Monday, they allowed, which is typically a day off, they allowed players to come to workouts in small groups. My understanding was this was like lifting and things like that. So groups of 10 or so. So it wasn't anything game plan or any of that type of stuff, but it was a step in the right direction in terms of, hey, the facility's back open. And then today we got word from Ohio State. So, this is official that the plan was to practice, and now it's day by day. No new tests, but that doesn't mean something doesn't pop tomorrow or Thursday or whatnot. So definitely a step in the right direction, but you're still kind of playing the wait and see game here with what happens and if this is spreading anymore, if they've got it under control. The other Big Ten teams and most teams around the country who have had to cancel games because of an outbreak have missed 2 games, if not more. So Wisconsin missed 2 games earlier this year in the Big Ten, Maryland, Minnesota, all of those it's been 2 weeks. So if Ohio State is able to get this under control enough to play against Michigan State, that will be a new precedent in a year that's been filled with those.
As soon as you set up the image for me of a weightlifting session, for example, and I'm sure that becomes much more complicated, much more stringent, so many more things that just have to be organized and so forth, just for guys to lift weights as opposed to what is normal. And this added layers of just protocols, guidelines, stipulations, health and safety standards that have to be attached to everything. Has there been any talk from Ryan Day, the coaches, the players, just about how much more difficult it's been just to practice, just to prepare for football games, just to be mentally prepared and physically prepared, and to be strategically prepared for these games?
You mean this week in particular, or just this season?
Just overall this season, how much more? Because to run a big-time football program, there's so much to do anyway. But then on top of that, there's this, I don't know, 20% more, 30% more that's just having to keep people separate and healthy and to meet guidelines.
Yes, definitely. That has been brought up periodically throughout the season. And, I think the approach that Ohio State's taken is, well, this is what everyone's going through. We just have to handle it better than others. And that's how we win on Saturdays. But there's no question it's changed things. I mean, if you've ever been to the Woody Hayes facility, Ohio State's practice facility, they've got a great weightlifting area and everything. I mean, world class. But a lot of that stuff has been moved out to their indoor practice field at times so they can space it out more and, have more room so that guys aren't, if you've been in any weight room, you're on top of each other with machines and whatnot. So yeah, I mean, that type of thing. They're not meeting in their normal meeting room this year, which doesn't sound like a big change, but again, they're using parts of the practice field and spreading out. And you're just in such a routine normally of a football player, and this year's really derailed that, starting back with no real spring practice and everything. But things like the meeting room, the weight room, it certainly has an effect, and not getting the normal, load or normal, routine, I think certainly plays a part. And it's, how much and how you handle it is up to each player and each team. But yeah, it has not been easy to get this season going and get it in, and doing all the things that football players need to do in order to play on Saturdays. So, credit to anyone, not just Ohio State, but any program that's been able to figure it out enough to get games in, and, especially the ones who have had, 9-10 games at this point.
Talking Ohio State football with Pat Murphy from Bucknuts on 247 Sports here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Please like the videos. That's very important, as well as share them out on social media. Not everyone knows that we're here, so spread the word. And, of course, subscribe here to Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Hit that bell for the notifications as well. All right, so the Big Ten scenario is that a team has to play 6 games to qualify for the Big Ten championship game, unless there are so many cancellations elsewhere in the conference that it brings down the average number of games played by each team. But somebody did the math recently, and there would have to be another 12 cancellations the rest of the season, which would just be, we would have bigger problems if there were 12 cancellations about playing any more football the rest of the year. So that's not going to happen. So I'm going to lay out one scenario for you, Pat, which is probably, I'm not a genius, I'm sure it's out there already, that Indiana, let's say they played the last 2 games of the season and finished 7-1 in the Big Ten, and Ohio State does not play one of the 2 final games, and they're 5-0. Okay, we could have an argument all day about who deserves it more, a 7-1 team or a 5-0 team. Well, the 5-0 team's got the better winning percentage. They won the head-to-head. But the 7-1 team actually played out the full schedule, and the 5-0 team missed games that, hey, if you want to be objective about it, could be lost, even though we would expect Ohio State to beat those teams. But if Indiana misses the next 2 weeks, they're 5-1, Ohio State's 5-0. What I find to be a very ludicrous possibility would be a 5-1 Indiana team going to play the Big Ten championship game, and a 5-0 Ohio State team going to play whomever, Wisconsin probably, the same day as the Big Ten championship game, when if they were given a forfeit, let's say, they would then qualify for the Big Ten championship game at 5-1 with the head-to-head win. Crazy.
Here's an even crazier scenario, or well, part of your scenario. Could it be that if Indiana and Northwestern play in the Big Ten championship game, now you do get the Big Ten champion out of that, so you get another part of what the committee looks at, but does a win against a Wisconsin team who, after Northwestern lost this past week, while they're head-to-head, is in favor of Northwestern, but Wisconsin just, has that national respect as, a long-time Big Ten contender, is that actually a better win than Ohio State playing Northwestern, and even a one-loss Northwestern, who I imagine would be ranked higher than Wisconsin? But just in the perception of things, we are dealing with people here, and they have metrics and all sorts of things, and they're supposed to look at this and not kind of take into account the program name. But let's be honest, when you're talking about Wisconsin Wisconsin versus Northwestern in terms of who play, the argument can be made that you could have a better win against a Wisconsin program, just in terms of perception. So, yeah, it's a crazy scenario in general. I mean, the easiest way to get from an Ohio State perspective to get to where you want to go is play these last 2 games against Michigan State this weekend, and then Michigan the final weekend. You win those games, you're in, you're done, you're good. And then, obviously the playoff committee would, so I would imagine, select an undefeated Ohio State team if they win the Big Ten. Like you said, though, it certainly gets complicated. And if Ohio State doesn't play this week or doesn't play the next week against Michigan, the Buckeyes won't have played those 6 games. I don't see the Big Ten changing the rules now, even if it means leaving, the defending 3-time champion Ohio State out. You've gotten this far into the season without making that rule change. If you did it now just to let Ohio State in, I think that sets a bad precedent. So that would be a very strange situation, especially, as you mentioned, Ohio State and Indiana played each other, and Ohio State won. So it would be it would be very 2020 to see something like that happen. If we're talking playoff selection, and if Ohio State doesn't play again until maybe that Wisconsin game, I think it would be difficult to say 5-0 Ohio State gets in over a Big Ten champion or another team from another conference. Maybe if you get a 6th game but don't get to play in the Big Ten championship game, something like that. But it certainly gets complicated here trying to figure out what the committee has to do. I do not wish to be on that committee this year, because we're just talking from the Ohio State perspective. There's a lot of other questions they'll have to answer, especially if other teams have to move or cancel games.
I have no issue with complicated. I understand it's complicated. I have an issue with it doesn't make sense. And yes, to send a 5-1 team that lost to the 5-0 team doesn't make sense when I understand the requirement of a 6th game, but you can automatically give that 6th game as a loss to that other team and they still qualify for the Big Ten championship game. So why not just send them? All right. Yeah, and I think to your point about the respect that Wisconsin has nationally and also from the playoff committee, I think is shown in their initial rankings. Even though Northwestern at 5-0 with arguably the best resume in the Big Ten, I certainly thought that they did just on paper, was ranked 8th, having just defeated Wisconsin. Wisconsin was still number 16 at 2-1 with a loss to Northwestern. So, all right, so the Indiana game, yeah, that's the game in question. And, of course, the Buckeyes won with a 35-7 lead, almost blew it second half, but still 42-35 winner. The pass defense has been scrutinized and giving up almost 500 yards to Indiana. That game can be perceived in a number of ways. It could be perceived as a good win, but not necessarily an impressive win. And Ohio State needing to impress the committee, as we talked about before we started to record, to your point, trying to maybe put that game in the past as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that's something that hasn't been talked about enough this week. Obviously, Ohio State needs to play these 2 games to get into the Big Ten championship game, be eligible for the Big Ten championship game. But also from a college football playoffs perspective, take the Big Ten championship game out of it. Say the committee is looking at Ohio State as that 4th seed, regardless of whether they play in the Big Ten championship game. I think you want as many games as possible separating that poor defensive performance. You give up 491 passing yards to Indiana. You want to show, and you didn't get the chance against Illinois, which probably would have been a step in the right direction for Ohio State. You want as many games as possible where the defense looks better and you put together a 60-minute game and those type of things. The committee chair even said last week, we'll be keeping an eye on Ohio State's defense. So knowing that, playing Michigan State, playing Michigan, ideally playing Northwestern in the Big Ten championship game, you want 3 straight weeks where, hey, the defense looks better. We've seen improvements. They're not giving up huge numbers. They're getting interceptions. They're forcing turnovers. They're doing the things that we expect from an Ohio State defense, as opposed to that Indiana game being in the recent memory, even though it was weeks away. If that's one of the last times they saw Ohio State play, that's going to be something they remember more closely. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind is the more games you can put in between that Indiana game and the end of the season, regardless of how it helps you for a Big Ten championship game, is good for potential selection in the playoff.
Got Pat Murphy on the line from Bucknuts talking Ohio State football here at MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. We would ask that you please subscribe and hit the bell for the notifications. That way you know when we're going live. So I don't know that it was necessarily a huge topic because of all the COVID protocols and the playoff talk and the Big Ten championship scenarios, but Michigan State actually beat a good team last week, Northwestern, who was 5-0, and regardless of how it's looked upon, they got up 17-0, lost the lead, but still had enough resolve to come back and take it in the 4th quarter. So I guess Sparty, despite being a bit down this year, can't be completely ignored.
No, definitely not. And there was talk on for the press conference today with the Michigan State media about, is there something to getting up for these big games for this team for whatever reason? They've played better, against a Michigan team that was a rivalry game and still early in the season looked like they might do something. Obviously, you mentioned the game against a highly ranked Northwestern team, and then the obvious part of the question was about this weekend in Ohio State and getting up for that game. And the answer was that they don't want to be a team that can't get it done against the other teams in the Big Ten, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to take these wins because they believe that that's what this team really is. And I think that Michigan State's probably somewhere in the middle. They're not as bad as they've looked at times, but they're also not as good as they looked at times. I watched that Northwestern game, and Northwestern just was inconsistent, which they hadn't been most of this year. As you mentioned, one of the best resumes in the Big Ten, if not the best. So it just wasn't a good performance by the Wildcats, and the Spartans played probably their best game of the season with that Michigan game up there as well. So this is a team that could be interesting for Ohio State, but from my perspective, it's not something I think the Buckeyes fear. I mentioned that pass defense. Rocky Lombardi has been inconsistent, Michigan State's quarterback this year. They do have a couple receivers that can do some things, but I do think this is a chance where Ohio State's pass defense could go out and have a solid game. I still think there's questions about personnel and scheme and things like that, as we talked about before, but have a solid game. And now you start to feel better about where that position group is, especially if you go up to East Lansing on Saturday and the weather does not cooperate for throwing the ball all over the yard, which happens a lot in this time of year in that part of the country.
Yeah, the Ohio State-Michigan State series has been an intriguing one down through the years, and for the first time since 2006, there will not be a Mark D'Antonio on the sideline for Michigan State, and he's been the author of a couple of huge upsets, of course, that have been in the thorn of the side of Urban Meyer and Ohio State here in the last decade. Pat, we appreciate you stopping by. We would encourage everyone to head on over to Bucknuts to check out Pat and everybody else on staff there at 247 Sports. Thanks a lot, Pat. Appreciate it. Enjoy the game on Saturday.
Sounds good. Thank you.